This is the second shiur in our Yeshiva al Kivoroi. And again, I pay tribute to Chaim and David for establishing this wonderful Yeshiva, this virtual Yeshiva, in the kever of a Talmid Chacham, to honor him by continuing his great legacy of the flame of Torah, the torch of Torah. And as I say, last week, he gave the longest standing shiur in the country for at least 50 years, a Gemara shiur every Tuesday night. And it's a great zechus that we are launching this new series of a Mishna a week, b'siyata dishmaya, in Avos. We know that, I heard my dad say so many times, that Mishna shares the oisius with neshama. And it's not just an anagram, a word game. It's that the Mishnah, the Torah Shebal Peh, is the neshama of the Torah. The klaf, the chumash, the Sefer Torah is the guf, the body of the Torah, whereas the halachas, the Torah Shebal Peh, is the neshama. And the neshama of a person too is visible through his mishnayos. When we study his halachas and his hanhagas, his behavior, that which he taught, that which he studied, his Mishna, that's where it's visible. You see his neshama. And that's what we come together to study. Leilu nishmas, lezecher nishmas, avinu hagodol. And we start tonight, Be'ezrat Hashem, the first Mishna in Pirkei Avos. Moshe Kibel Torah misinai u'mesara lihoshua. And if it's shaykh to say that my father had a favorite passage, I think the Rav that introduces this Mishnah was possibly one of his favorite pieces. Moshe Kibel Torah misinai. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. U'mesara lihoshua. And he handed it, he transmitted it, he conveyed it to Yehoshua. Yehoshua li Zakeinim, Yehoshua to the Zakeinim who are after him. The Zakenim leNeviim, Neviim Mesarua la'anshe Knesses hagedoilo, to the men of the great assembly. This is the chain of the transmission of the Torah through the generations. And then we learn the three things that they said. But the first striking point of the Mishnah is that Masechta Avos, of all the Masechtas in Shas, should be introduced with the chain of the Messiah back to Hashem, back to Har Sinai. And the question begs itself, why Avos? Should be Brachas, Shabbos. These are Masechtas that should introduce the chain of the Messiah, the Shalsheles HaTorah. Why should Avos, Dafka, start like that? And the famous answer of the Rav Mibar Tanura that my dad, Rosh Yeshiva, loved to share was that the Mishnah is coming to teach us that Brachas, Shabbos, we know that comes from Har Sinai. But the Chiddush over here is that Midos, Derech Eretz, Menschlichkeit, is also included in this Torah. Moshe Kibel, Torah misinai. What does Torah include? Says the Rav, our Mishnah is coming to tell us that Torah that he received at Har Sinai, that was revealed at Har Sinai, included Avos, included behavior, how a mensch behaves, how he conducts himself, his midas and his derech eretz. That too we didn't invent. By the nations of the world, every generation and every Medina has a different take on what are the values, how does a mensch behave. All made up. Experience, reading, developed over centuries, over generations. Lahavdil, Moshe Kibel Torah misinai, the midas of a yid were revealed in an instant. It didn't develop, it was revealed, and it came from the Borei Olam. The manufacturer himself told us not only how to keep Shabbos, how to keep you, how to design a mensch. That's the answer of the Rav. The Tiferes Yisrael takes a completely different track. And he says that Moshe Kibel Torah misinai is coming to teach us that if you had Kol HaTorah Kula, but you didn't have Midas, you didn't have Torah yet. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, so that you'll know lots of Torah, so that you'll keep lots of mitzvahs. You'll keep Shabbos and Kashrus and Brachas. But it has to end up in producing a refined person. When we get up from the Sefer, how do we look? How does a Ben Torah conduct himself? That refinement of character is what Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai was coming to include. This too, it's coming to produce this. Not only does it come from Shemaim, but it's coming to produce a mensch. There's a Mordecai Meise where Rav Meir Shapira, the founder and the one who popularized the Daf HaYomi and achieved so much for Torah, and himself was such a gaon, he created an outstanding yeshiva, Chachmei Lublin. Rav Meir Shapira, after he passed away, he came to one of his colleagues, the Eretz Tzvi, Rav Tzvi Frumer, who was an outstanding gaon and wrote an outstanding sefer in Halacha. And he came to him in a dream, and Rav Tzvi Frumer, the Eretz Tzvi, he said to him, Mistoma, how did your din go? Mistoma, you did well, you know, your din in Shemaim, you got so many zechuyos of Daf HaYomi. Look at your wonderful achievements. And Rav Meir Shapira told him, he says, here in Shemaim, they're not so impressed with achievements. It's not so much the maisim. The ikar here is your character. They want to know about your humility, your refinement, your avos. Of course, you have to keep kol Torah kula, and you certainly have to learn Torah, and that will define so much the eternity. But he said the ikar is, they want to know, finally, what type of character did you produce? So let's start learning the Mishnah. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. He received the Torah from Sinai. And we notice that then it says, Umasara li Yoshua. By Moshe it says, Kibel, he received, he accepted. And by Yoshua it says that Moshe Rabbeinu, Masara li Yoshua. He handed it to him, he conveyed it to him. Why the difference? It could have said by Hashem also, he conveyed it. Not he was Mekabel. One of the answers, there's a number of answers. HaKadosh Baruch Hu couldn't moiser, hand over intact the whole Torah as HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows it. A human being can't take the whole Torah of Hashem. Certainly Hashem knows much more about the Torah than we know. So it's not Shaykh Hashem was moiser all his Torah intact. Moshe was moiser his Torah to Yoshua. Moshe could only be Makabel what's Shaykh for a mensch to be Makabel. There's a slightly different take on this. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. It doesn't say Moshe learned the Torah at Sinai. It's a Kabbalah. First, there has to be a Kabbalah of the Torah. Moshe had to accept the Torah as a Kabbalah. He didn't learn it from Hashem. He accepted it from Hashem. Why Moshe? Moshe himself asked this question. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe all the Talmidei Chachamim, and he showed him Rabbi Akiva. And Moshe sat in the 8th row, the Gemara tells us, of Rabbi Akiva's Beis Medrash, and he listened in on one of Rabbi Akiva's shiurim, a pupil, a lomdas. And Moshe Rabbeinu had a chalisha sadah. He said, I don't understand his Torah. I don't understand what he's saying. Why didn't you give the Torah through him? Seems he's a much greater Talmid Chacham, if one can say that. Why was Moshe Rabbeinu chosen? Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't chosen because necessarily he was the greatest intellect ever. Maybe he was. It's not why he was chosen. He was the greatest Kli Kibul ever. He was the greatest Makabel. He was able to receive, to open himself without any of his own opinion, any of his own negias, any prejudice, without any of him. Say, Rebbeinu Shalom, I'm making a space, your Torah, you tell me every single thing. That's why only Moshe could be Makabel. Once Moshe was Makabel the Torah, Rabbi Akiva could introduce his Shitta, his Torah of Pilpul, the tagin. But Moshe Rabbeinu had to accept the Torah because he was the honor of Mikol Adam. And ultimately, as my father, Rosh Yeshiva, used to say so many times he told me this about the school children. He said, you don't learn Torah with your brain, you learn Torah with your heart. You've seen people who had average brains become outstanding Talmidei Chachamim. Because Torah, you got to be Makabel. Torah, you got to attract to yourself. There's got to be a polar attraction. And that was Takazocher, to be a Kli Kibul. He was Makabel, a Torah in tells. The Torah of Malchus tells, as Rabbi Zochi said, and he was able to give it out for all the decades. The Mishnah goes on to say, Moshe Kibel, it was Moshe, only Moshe. He could do the Kibul. He was Makabel the Torah. And he got it where from? Where did he Makabel? Sinai. And the question is, all the Meforshim asked. The Maharal introduces with about 9 questions. Why Sinai? He didn't get the Torah Sinai. He got the Torah from Hashem himself. Sinai was only the GPS. It was the geolocation. Didn't get the Torah from Sinai. And a number of answers given from the Maharal himself that you can't say that anybody, compared to Hashem, even Moshe Rabbeinu is not right to be a Talmud, so to speak. That's how the Maharal says. It's not a Rebbe to Talmud relationship. The rest of the transmission of Torah could be, but Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, not directly from Hashem, from Sinai. This is another pshat. It was Sinai because of that Ma'amad called Sinai, where all Klal Yisrael gathered together and said Nasa v'nishma. And HaKadosh Baruch revealed himself to the nation, not to an individual, to the nation. It was because of Sinai, through Sinai, the vehicle of Sinai, that he got the Torah. Also, obviously, it means Sinai, as we know from the Midrashim, was the smallest mountain. It was humility, as Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest of all men, to teach that godless in Torah, success in Torah, that Torah should speak to you. That's also a form of godless in Torah. That it should mean something to you. That's only through this midah of Moshe and Sinai and Midbar, this midah of Anova. Through this Anova, through this midah of Anova comes Torah. The Mishnah goes on to say, Moshe Kibel Torah mi Sinai u'masara li Yehoshua. He handed it over to Yehoshua. Surely he taught to all Klal Yisrael. He didn't just teach it to Yehoshua, he taught it to Aaron, then Aaron's son. And again, he taught the whole nation Torah. How does it say, u'masara li Yehoshua? Obviously, the Mishnah is teaching not who he taught it to, who he was moiser to. There's something called the Masorah of Torah that we're introducing mensch l'chayim. It's called a Masorah. How to be a mensch also has to have a Masorah. You have to bring a raya that this is called a Yiddish mensch. This midah that one's addressing, bring a raya that it comes from the base midrash. This is called shalsheles HaTorah, the chain of transmission of Torah. And it was only to Yehoshua. From the whole nation, Moshe Rabbeinu handed his vision as a seamless whole. It wasn't just pieces of information. It's not that he just taught him all the halachas he knows, all the pilpulim he knows. No. He handed him a vision of life, a vision of the generation, a vision of Klal Yisrael. Everything perfectly intact. And that went only to Yehoshua. Why to Yehoshua? Because Yehoshua was the greatest Kli Kibel in the nation. Kli Kibel is the person who is closest to the Gadol, the Gedolim of the previous generation, who was most, like Moshe Rabbeinu, able to efface his own ego, his own agenda, and be a Makabel. Yehoshua had the bikush. He wanted to learn. He followed Moshe around all day, every moment, an extra hour was worth it. And he had the humility to always be attending to Moshe Rabbeinu and attending to the Beis Medrash, making sure that the Beis Medrash was in order. These are the midas we know about Yeshua. He was the greatest Makabel in the nation, and he wasn't necessarily the greatest Talmid Chacham. The Ramban tells us that Yeshua was mentioned only fifth of the Meraglim, and they were listed in order, not of the tribes, of their own personal stature. And they were not the greatest either. There were much, much greater people, many hundreds of greater people in there. And yet, it was Dafka Yehoshua ben Nun who became the first natural leader. He became the heir of Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because he was the greatest Kli Kibel. He was the most worthy to accept through his own self-effacement, through his devotion, through his commitment to learning from and to accepting. This bikush and this humility are the keys to the chain of transmission of Torah. And the chain of transmission of Torah didn't stop there. It continues in every single generation. There's a Mesorah of Torah, and who gets to be it? Those few Gedolei Hador who were most devoted to and most self-effaced to accept this seamless unit, this vision of Torah for that generation. And this is what our Mishna is introducing. The seamless vision, including halacha and pilpul and avos and midas. And Dad was zeicher to be a makabel for South Africa. The South African Torah, he was one of the makablim. And perhaps the key to the Messiah. Someone said to me during Shiva, he says, it's not just a great personal loss. It's not just the loss of a great Talmid Chacham and Rosh Yeshiva. It's the loss of a Messiah, a dear friend said. The Zakana Rabbonim, who had such a glorious Messiah from his own Rosh Yeshivas, from Reb Baruch Saratsky, his Rosh Yeshiva who he learned with for about 7 years, all afternoon. He was so close to him. To Reb Motel Katz and Reb Elia Meir Bloch, from them all, one generation back. The tells the Rov, Reb Baruch Ber Levovitz, one generation back. Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, to the Vilna Gaon, the Messiah that we had. He brought us the Messiah from Telz. And I must say at this point that he himself was very proud of the fact that his Messiah in Rabbanus came dafka from my mother's side, her illustrious father, Rav Moshe Reuven, her grandfather, Rav Schwartz, who was responsible for the first Yeshiva Gedolah in America outside New York, and about whom Rav Gifter said, all the Torah in Baltimore comes through Rav Schwartz. This was part of his Messiah, and that's where he learned to have she'ifas for gadlus in Rabbanus. And now let's go on to Haim Amru, Shloisha Dvorim. So the Torah eventually gets to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and they taught three things, three halachas. Hevu Masunim Badin, be deliberate in judgment. Number 2 was Hamidu Salmidim Harbe, establish many Talmidim. And 3, Asu Siyag La Torah, make a fence for your Torah. And the question is, why these 3? Are they 3 arbitrary things? It says, Haim Amru Shloisha Dvorim. They said 3 things, almost as though the 3 things are included in that. They said 3 things. They said that a lot depends on these 3 things. I hope we can get through it in a few minutes. I'm going to try. The Tiferes Yisrael says that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they were the men of the Great Assembly. What does that mean, they were the men of the Great Assembly? There were 120 of them at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. There was a pivotal point in Jewish history. They were called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, the Gemara says, because Moshe Rabbeinu said about Hashem is Hagodol, Hagibor, V'Hanoiro. And then successive generations of Nevi'im, including Yirmiyahu and Daniel, said, where's his gadlus? Klal Yisrael, it's in Churban. Until the Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle came along and they re-established. They said, no, Hashem's gadlus is the fact that he is patient. His Noira Osav, without his Noira Osav, Klal Yisrael couldn't Chas v'Shalom survive in the Golus. So they reinstated. In other words, their gadlus was the fact that where everybody else saw Churban and hopelessness, the Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle saw Shechina. They saw Hashem guarding the events. That's called gadlus. My father had that vision. He saw in South Africa yeshivas, illustrious Talmidei Chachomim, where others only saw a midbar. And the Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle realized that the second Beis HaMikdash was temporary. And they were preparing Klal Yisrael for Galus. And not just Galus, it was the end of Nevuah, as the Tivei Yisrael says. There was no more prophecy in Israel. Mordechai, the last of the prophets, Chaka, Zachariah, and Malachi, they were part of the Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle. But this was now the end of Nevuah in Klal Yisrael, where there had been thousands of Nevi'im throughout history. They were the Yeshiva Bochrim then, were B'nai HaNevi'im. They went to yeshivas to study Nevuah. The great question was, how's Yiddishkeit, how's Torah going to survive without Nevuah? As long as he had prophecy, it was Divrei Elokim Chaim. Hashem was alive, he was talking to people, he was communicating. It was a personal Yechidus with the Borei Olam. But when that's gone, how is Klal Yisrael going to survive? History, Golus. And Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle, they were responsible for putting into place the system and the values that kept us going till this day. The fact that we're studying Torah this day is through what the Anshe Knesset HaGedoyle taught in this Mishna. And you know what they taught? They said that when Nevuah stops, Klal Yisrael will survive on Torah, Chochmah, Limud Torah, Talmud Torah. And that's what this mission is about. Those are the three keys. And what did they teach? And in retrospect, what can we see? We can see that they were right. Klal Yisrael survived thousands of years of Golus without Nevuah, through Torah, through wisdom, through learning Torah. And these are the three things. They said this shift from the rule of Nevuah, prophecy, to the rule of Chochmah requires three things. Number one, Hevu Mesunim Badin. Chochmah, these are the midas of a Chocham, a true Chocham. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't be rash. You can't decide rashly. The Chachomim of every generation, the Gedolim of every generation, Mesunim, be deliberate in judgment. As Dad would say, think it through again. Take advice, he always said. This is for your yoatz. Don't react. Think. Classic Dad was, realize that your first reaction is just round one. Think it through again. In the morning, you're going to have round two. And maybe that won't be the final one. Be deliberate in judgment. Another classic one he said is, don't fight today. Don't make a machlokas today if you can put it off till tomorrow. That's one of the things that you should always put off till tomorrow. Don't do today the machlokas that you can do tomorrow. Mesunim, also on a personal level. Be patient as he did, even when provoked. Give them a chance to come round. They're going to realize it. They'll come round. They know what happened. Create a space between what happened and your reaction. It's not ping pong. Someone does something, it doesn't mean you have to answer back immediately. Don't shoot from the hip. As a mechanech and as a parent, take the long view. All these are the midas of a chacham that he taught. Chachma means first rule of chachma that kept Yiddishkeit alive till this day. Musunim badin. Think it through slowly. Hamidu talmidim harbe. Establish a lot of talmidim, not the elite, not only the best ketvach. A lot of talmidim. Chazon Ish was again starting a kollel for the Iluyim, and from them we'll make real Gedolim. Chazon Ish said, no, you don't know where the real Talmidei Chacham are going to come from. Doesn't matter about the Kishron. Everyone has a chance. Harbe, Hamidu Salmidim Harbe, not Akvei Shammai, who said, only the worthy, teach them all Torah. The Torah will talk to them. The Torah will raise them up. But Hamidu, Before she explained, raise them up, give them stature, make them independent of you, make them great. Dad did that, and he was also miming them in another way. He treated them with such deference. He was miming his children. He was miming his Talmudim. He put them on a pedestal. He didn't try and make you feel how brilliant he was. He wanted you to feel how brilliant you are. And you naturally grew into that. That's a genuine teacher. You don't go away thinking, oh, what a brilliant teacher. You go away thinking, I'm really smart. And finally, the last of them, this was the second midah of Chokhmah. In order to develop a culture of learning that will survive the Golus, everyone has to be learned. As many people as you can, teach them Torah. And the third one, asu siagla Torah. When you're teaching Torah, don't water it down. Never falsify Torah. Teach it as it is. He always said that. Whatever questions come up has to be dealt with appropriately. It's Torah. You don't have to sell Torah. Torah will sell itself. You teach Torah. Treat people nicely. The Torah will raise them up. Asusiagla Torah. What does it mean? Make a fence around the Torah? I heard my dad say so many times since I was a boy. There are certain fights that you can't win with people, with yourself. Don't get into the ring with professional boxers. You can't fight. The better part of valor, discretion. Stay out of the ring. Nowhere we don't go, because that's a fight we can't win. And these are the keys, the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah taught. They're keys that we need to know, personal midas. They're the keys of Chokhmah. They're the keys of the chain of transmission of Chokhmah. And if we're learning Torah today, after thousands of years without nevuah, without direct communication from Hashem, it means that the shilton of Chokhmah that they taught was very successful. Thank you.
Thanks, Dov. That was such an inspirational shiur. Really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else did too. And really applicable to learn, as Daddy was an embodiment of Pirkei Avos. So thank you so, so much. And look forward to hearing you next week. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a good evening.